Playtesting is on its way, and oh boy, I have some work to do, so let's talk about that. If you've seen my previous devlog, you'll know that opening up playtests was a terrifying moment for me. And while I'm positively surprised by the responses I've gotten so far, of course, any positive feedback I get, I need to knock down like a point or two, accounting for the fact that people are just like kind of being nice, the general ratings still were around a 7 or 8 in terms of enjoyment. So even if I take some points off of that and take that down to a 6, I'd say that at this point, for a very unfinished alpha build of my game, that's a pretty good milestone. Now, all the ranking and subjective opinion pieces aside, I want to talk about the thing that I mentioned in my last video. What I actually got to see playtesters do in the footage that needs fixing. Because that, naturally, has made for a much longer list than what people actually write down as feedback. So, broadly speaking, we can split these issues into 4 separate categories. Lack of tutorials, general gameplay tweaks, combat changes, and UI improvements. Let's start with the tutorialization, as you always should. In this version of the game, there is effectively no tutorials, partly because I haven't bothered making any yet, but also because I wanted to see how much of the game's core systems are intuitive enough to not need a tutorial, and I must say, the results kind of surprised me. Almost everyone got confused about the inventory, for instance, not being able to figure out how to equip items into the usable item slots, which is only possible to do at checkpoints. People just generally didn't seem to pick up on the fact that your pause menu is different while you're standing on a checkpoint to begin with, meaning they also missed out on the entire leveling up of their stats. I've watched people go through and play the game while holding on to well over 1,000 experience that went entirely unused. I was under the impression that most of these things would naturally be discovered fairly quickly and wouldn't require any tutorial pop-ups to explain them. But clearly, there is a need for these things. Even the lock-on feature, which players are guided toward with the bottom right action menu displaying left and right triggers to do different things, went entirely unused by some people, who then went on to tell me that they found it hard to focus on any given enemy. I mean, yeah, that's what the lock-on is there for. But that just made one thing very clear. If you want players to take note of any part of your game, you need to pop it up in front of their faces, even if it seems simple and self-explanatory. If people don't know to go look for something, they're not gonna go looking for it, which will result in people totally missing out on some major features of the game. So making a simple tutorial screen that I can just toss up in gameplay every now and then, as well as maybe keeping like a catalog for people to reread those screens at any given time, might be a good thing. That way, if you skip over something and you want to reread it, you can find that info still in the pause menu, for instance. That would also allow me to make some tutorial screens that explain less important things that you'll only see when scrolling through this catalog, if need be. Either way, tutorials are much needed. Which brings me to the general gameplay tweaks, because I also need to change up the order of some of these tutorials, I think. Right now, you can get into a combat encounter before ever touching a checkpoint, which, because of how my level loading works with checkpoints, will crash the game if you die in that first combat encounter. I personally never died in there, because I can kill these enemies with my hands tied behind my back at this point, but fresher players have proven that you very much can and will die in some cases here. And that causes an issue, because the game keeps track of the last level where you touch the checkpoints and then reload you into that level when you die. But if you haven't touched the checkpoint yet, an issue pops up. So I can either mess with my level loading code, or I can ensure that you never see an enemy until you've touched your first checkpoint at least once, which is a lot easier to do. So I'll change things up a little bit to introduce the inventory first, so give the player a couple of items and make them move them around in their inventory. Then I will show them the checkpoints, so that they ensure that they've touched a checkpoint before getting into any combat encounters. and then I will throw the first enemy at them. I also think that the current linear progression for the tutorial maybe is best changed up a little bit. I want the very first room to contain the door to the boss fights, instead of it being the very last room you see. That way you'll instantly know what you're working toward throughout the tutorial, and why you're gathering these keys around this dungeon to begin with. And then the level should be laid out in such a way that when you find the third key, you loop back around to the first level in the dungeon fairly quickly and fairly easily, now that you have the keys to open the door to the boss fight. Aside from all that, the gameplay tweaks don't seem to require any major changes off of these test plays. For platforming, I really need to start implementing some coyote time, where you can still jump after leaving solid ground for a split second, because people, including myself really, are finding the jumping input unresponsive, which seems to be entirely due to the fact that we're all used to platforming games having some type of grace window when falling off ledges. Which is kind of annoying to implement, because I can't really use Unreal's built-in jump function, because the one that Unreal provides you with, of course, checks whether or not you're grounded. So I'll have to write up a slightly more custom solution for that myself. It shouldn't be a big deal, but I was kinda hoping that I didn't have to, but it seems like I will have to. Which brings us to combat, the meat and potatoes of the game. There's a lot of small but important issues that are going to be fairly easy to fix, all things considered. A lot of spells don't use MP cost, which is easy to fix. I already have code in place for that. I was just too dumb to fill out the values for some of the spells. You can switch weapons mid-attack, which causes some weirdness. I actually did specifically think about weapon switching and combos, resetting the combo every time you switch a weapon to prevent some exploiting from weapons with shorter combos to weapons with longer combos and vice versa. But I never considered switching in the middle of an attack. Solving this is simple though. The weapon switching should just check if you have the attacking gameplay tag, and if you do, not allow you to switch. There we go. Solved. The Shaman's rune attack is just too hard to dodge at the moment. I need to give it a more obvious tell for the timing, and it needs to deal way less damage. I think it also should be possible to counter this by hitting the Shaman to make the runes disappear from around you before they attack you to begin with, which makes the players shift their focus from whatever they're doing at the moment to go find and hit the Shaman when runes pop up around the player. That'll be a nice way to make the gameplay just a little bit more dynamic than press X until the credits roll. Enemies crowding around players also seems to be happening way too much, where it gets really difficult to actually do anything, because at any given time one of the enemies is going to be aggressive towards you and attacking you, meaning you effectively get stuck in like a loop of getting juggled by the enemies. For that, I also already implemented a system where the game instance keeps a list of enemies that are allowed to attack. When an enemy tries to go into its aggressive state, chasing or attacking you, it first checks whether or not to see if this list already has 5 or more enemies that are aggressive on you. And if there is, the enemy just stays in its passive state. So because of that, you now never have to deal with more than 5 enemies at a time. This will take some more testing though, because I feel like this opens up some exploits where you can attack enemies which then won't be allowed to attack you back. But the revenge attacks still will trigger either way, because those don't rely on the AI. So maybe it's fine? Again, we'll need some testing for this. When you die in a level where there is a combat trial with a spawner, the spawner doesn't reset properly, seemingly. I'm not entirely sure why this is, but the solution will be fairly easy. Just moving the checkpoints out of levels with spawners in them. Sometimes you just gotta work smarter and not harder. So yeah, that might sound like a lot, but all these issues have fairly straightforward and easy to implement solutions. But I'm glad to see that, aside from a couple of easy to fix issues, generally the game's combat is being perceived as pretty good and right on track to being fun. And now it is time for polishing touches to that which I hate with a fiery passion: UI. The very first order of business here is to add a death screen. Right now when you die, you just kind of flash back over to the last save point, and that is very disorienting. Getting proper feedback that you died is very important. This is one of those things that I knew I was going to have to do and I was still missing in the game, but seeing how people actually like deal with that and react to that it really shows me that this is a lot more important for people's perception of how the game plays than I thought it was going to be. So this is not necessarily something that I now realized that I needed, it's just something that got majorly bumped up on the priority list for the next round of playtests. The action menu with spells on them should grey out when you don't have enough mana to cast a specific spell or when there aren't enemies nearby. Both of which are already coded to stop you from using these spells, but that's not really clear enough at the moment, because you don't really know when you can and cannot use certain spells. Unless you just kind of try to use them, which is sloppy game design at best. And then there is the inventory tweaks. You see, this is the reason that I haven't released my inventory plugin yet, because I need to battle test this thing before putting it out into the world. When you pick up an item that's already in your inventory, it doesn't always add that item to the stack in your inventory if it finds an empty slot first, which is just really messy. Working with chests is also annoying, because you have to move all the items over between the two inventories, which, especially with the controller, is a real pain to do. So there should just be a button that instantly swaps an item from one inventory into the other, from the player to the chest, or from the chest to the player. I also should point out with some text above both of the inventories which inventory is the chest and which inventory is the player, because I feel like that wasn't always entirely clear for all the playtesters. There's also no way to tell if an item is equipable in your action slots without just trying to put them into your action slots, which, again, much like before, is just bad game design. You should be able to tell at a glance what type of item you're working with. And usable items can be either things like spells or consumables or whatever, but it needs to be clear at a glance when you pick up a new item, whether or not you can equip it into your action slots, or whether or not it's just an item that's going to be sitting in your inventory as like a crafting resource. And sometimes the menus just kind of bug out and show multiple menus at a time, which, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I have no idea where to start fixing that, but at some point it'll be fixed, I'm sure. So as you can see, there's still a lot of work yet to be done on this game. And this was only one round of playtests with a handful of people. There's also a lot of other things that I want to add or have changed. I moved away from using global illumination with Lumen because, frankly, it kind of messed with the cell shading for the game, and the performance impact is insane. Especially since that technology mostly improves realistic looking games, and well, this isn't that. So I am back to using traditional light baking, and that's just about tripled the FPS for most players, making it actually reasonable to run on its Steam Deck at anywhere near decent graphic settings. Which is effectively my hardware benchmark for this game. My game should reasonably be able to run on a Steam Deck. If that can handle it, most PCs should be able to handle it as well. And hell, if I ever get crazy enough to port this thing to any sort of console, if it runs on a Steam Deck, it'll probably be fine on current or next-gen consoles as well. But yeah, I don't really think that that's gonna be like a thing that I do. I also really want to add in some QuickTime events to spice up the combat. Kingdom Hearts is a big inspiration for this game after all, and as mind-numbing as some of the reaction commands can be in Kingdom Hearts 2, pressing the triangle in between pressing X a lot and having something just cool happening is a really big improvement for a hack-and-slash game. So, long story short, I am pleasantly surprised by the state of the game in the eyes of most people that have been playing it. But also, as expected, there still is a long way to go. So, yeah, I better get back to work. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. And of course, an extra massive thank you to my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas, and my Cave Student tier supporters, Oiku,